Welcome to today's Middle East Policy Forum. Let me express my deep appreciation to ExxonMobil for the very generous support that they've given to the forum over the years. Today actually concludes the 15th year of the forum. It's been a center of our Middle East Studies program, and I've been happy to lead it during those years. And I could not be more pleased than I am today with today's program, that we'll be able to profile one of our most distinguished professors, Dr. Benjamin Hopkins. Today, Ben will be discussing his most recent book, Ruling the Savage Periphery, Frontier Governance and the Making of the Modern State, published last year by Harvard University Press. Dr. Hopkins is Associate Professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University and currently Director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies. He earned his PhD from the University of Cambridge, 2006. His research and writings focus on Afghanistan, British imperialism, and South Asian subcontinent. He's author of two books prior to the one we'll be discussing today. The first, Making of Modern Afghanistan in 2008, and the second, Fragments of the Afghan Frontier in 2012, co-authored with Marcus Marson. And joining us today in our discussion will be Dr. Dina Khoury, Professor of History and International Affairs here at GW. Her expertise is the history of the Middle East, and she too is a publisher. Her first book, State and Provincial Society in the Ottoman Empire, Cambridge University Press in 1997. And her most recent book, Iraq in Wartime, Soldiering, Martyrdom, and Remembrance, again, Cambridge University Press in 2013. So following the remarks by Dr. Hopkins and a conversation with Dr. Khoury, there'll be an opportunity for you all to ask questions. At any time during the program, if you would pose your questions in the chat box, and we will do our very best to respond to as many of those as possible in the time permitted. Ben, congratulations. And over to you.
Well, Skip, thank you so much for such a kind introduction. It's just a real pleasure to be able, number one, to give an intellectual talk about my book and step away from my administrative responsibilities, but two, to do it with such wonderful colleagues and friends as Skip and Dina. I mean, I need to acknowledge up front that both of them have their fingerprints all over this work, whether it be, through the conversations Skip and I had in his office, or all the interactions that Dina and I have had over the years, kind of talking through the issues here. Definitely, they are a part of this work. And I'd also just like to say hi to everyone. It's so nice not to see you because I just have your names on the screen, but colleagues, thank you for coming. And it's just nice to be in this kind of environment. So the brief I've been asked to do is give a short kind of overview of the work that then hopefully will set Dina and I and the broader audience up for a conversation about it. And what I'd like to do then is just kind of highlight some of what I think are the most important themes and contributions of the work. I'm very aware that I'm speaking to a Middle East audience with my own background really as a South Asian historian. So I want to both demonstrate the linkages, but also the differences between these realms that I think are well articulated in the book. So let me turn really quickly to the book and talk about my book, Ruling the Savage Periphery. And if I were to characterize it in the kind of elevator, one-line speech, it is a global history of a system of frontier rule that becomes ubiquitous through the course of the late 19th and 20th century. It's a really wide-ranging piece of scholarship that, although it begins in the location of my own specialty, namely along the frontier of Afghanistan, moves into the Middle East, into sub-Saharan Africa, and then into the southwest of the United States, and actually ends on the pampas of Argentina. And what it's really fundamentally about is looking at the periphery of the emerging state system of the 19th century, and critically considering, number one, how is this space governed? And number two, what effect does that form of governance have on the system itself? And so one of the arguments that I make in the book is that the kind of conceptualization or dichotomization, as it were, between a center of imperial rule and a periphery, a frontier out there of imperial rule, really collapses the more you look at the ways that imperial, but also national administrators decided to govern these frontier spaces. So let me then, with that kind of broad thesis articulated, turn to what I think are really three cogent elements of the work that I'd like to underline. And the first I'd like to put out there is really what I consider to be the theoretical contribution and backbone of the work. And that is this idea around the issue of the frontier. Now, usually when I say frontier or when we hear frontier, we almost always think of places. And yet at the very beginning of the work, I articulate that I don't conceive of frontiers as places, but rather as practice, or rather a discrete set of practices which are manifest in specific places over time. Now, when I articulate frontier as practice, that has a couple of implications. In the first, it means you can have more than one frontier. And in the second instance, it means those frontiers can move over time. So rather than thinking about territorially fixed places, what we have are temporally and geographically mobile practices. And I think that's really important to acknowledge up front. What then are the practice or practices which constitute frontiers? If frontier is practice, then what is the practice that makes it, as it were? And the practice, I argue in the book, is not a single practice, but rather actually a set of governing practices which collectively constitute a category of what I call frontier governmentality. It's actually composed of four interrelated practices that appear either singly or in combination elsewhere in the imperial and non-imperial world of the 19th and 20th century. But the unique combination that they come together in is this kind of quadrangle of practices. When they come together in that foursome, this is where you have a frontier. And so what is the practice which constitutes frontier, and more broadly, this issue of frontier governmentality? Well, it's these four elements. First of all, indirect rule. In particular, an emphasis on ruling the peoples of this space through their own customs and traditions. Of course, those customs and traditions being defined by imperial and state authorities. Secondly, what I call sovereign pluralism. You can call it suzerainty, you can call it layered sovereignty, as for instance, Lauren Benton does. You can call it nested sovereignty. But it's the idea that instead of a single indivisible sovereignty, we have multiple coexisting ideas of sovereignty that are both officially as well as substantively acknowledged to be such. Thirdly, and perhaps the most innovative category, because I haven't seen this elsewhere, is what I call imperial objecthood, which the peoples inhabiting the space of the frontier are neither fish nor fowl. They're neither in nor out of the system. They are not colonial subjects, nor are they national citizens, as I could talk about, for instance, in the United States, yet they remain connected to and acted upon by national and imperial authorities. They become objects of action with no meaningful recourse to contest that action in any sort of judicial or indeed political manner. So they become objects, and thus this category of imperial objecthood. And then the fourth element is economic dependency, that these people are both individually and collectively rendered dependent upon the surrounding economy that's being constructed at this point in time. So when you find these four elements present in combination, indirect rule, sovereign pluralism, imperial objecthood, economic dependency, there you have a frontier. And that frontier is ruled by this set of practices which collectively constitute frontier governmentality. Now, if this is the theoretical contribution of the work, then acknowledging my bona fides as a historian, what is the hard work of history, as it were? What is the historical intervention? And this is where we come to the specifics of the case. I said in my opening that this is a global history of a system of frontier rule, a system of frontier governmentality. So how is this story told? And it's really articulated by following two sets of characters, I would say. The first character or set of characters is actually law and the replication of a particular type of legal code, both within and without the British Empire globally. The book starts on the northwest frontier of British India with Afghanistan, looking at a law that's put in place and still operative along the Pakistan-Afghanistan frontier called the Frontier Crimes Regulation. This is first promulgated in 1872 and then followed around the global empire, appearing as far afield as the Middle East, as we'll talk about no doubt in our discussion, Nigeria, and my favorite one, Kenya. Substantively, it's replicated elsewhere in the world, for instance, in the United States with some of the legal codes governing American Indian reservations and along the Pampas in Argentina. So on the one hand, I trace the imperial career of both a legal code, but more broadly, the substance of that code as it gets replicated in administrative practice. The other set of characters that the work follows are actually a set of administrators themselves. There's a number of men that kind of rise to the top. Of course, they're all men at this point in time, who are frontier hands, as it were, in the respective spaces of empire. For my own specialist area of the Afghan-Pakistan frontier, the British Indian and Afghan frontier, the key player is a man named Robert Sandeman, who becomes really the key administrator along this stretch of boundary between the civilization of British India and the savagery, as it were, of the Afghan kingdom in the late 19th century. However, Sandeman has his doppelgangers, as it were, spread globally, many of whom, interestingly, have a personal, if not professional, connection to the Afghan frontier of British India. So perhaps the most famous of these characters that the book looks at is Lord Lugard, who of course is famous as the imperial administrator of sub-Saharan Africa, in particular of Nigeria. And yet Lugard actually cut his teeth on the British Indian frontier with Afghanistan in the 1870s, at the very moment that the other character of the work, namely the law, is put in place. For our purposes, talking to an audience of Middle East historians and specialists, there are some other characters who both resonate with this personification and have this direct tie back to the Afghan frontier, most importantly, Henry Dobbs, who begins his career as a revenue official under Sandeman's tutelage, and then arrives in the Basra Vilayat of the Ottoman Empire with the Indian Expeditionary Force in 1914, and rises up to the High Commissioner of Mandatory Iraq during the 1920s. So this theoretical story of frontier governmentality is given a very palpable and real world expression through the administration and concretization of law along these places of the periphery, which is then exercised through the frontier hands, the administrators, the men who actually actualize this. And perhaps we can go in through our discussion to some of these personal stories because they're actually quite interesting. So what the book tries to do is marry this theoretical argument with a very detailed look at the historical expression of this. And one of the other issues I would raise about the historical expression of this, which I think is really important. And I state in the book, but I don't make as much of it as perhaps I should, is the extraordinarily compressed time period that this happens in. The main kind of erection of this system of frontier governmentality, or its creation, really happens in the 1870s and 1880s. And it happens a couple of places around the world, seemingly independent from one another. And from these places, it is spread and replicated along imperial and national frontiers elsewhere. And so I think that's a really interesting element of this story that I'm happy to expand upon and talk about why that is. The final thing I would like to then bring up, since I've done the theoretical and the historical contribution, is, again, being aware I'm talking to the Middle East Policy Forum, thinking about the policy implications of this. Because the book actually doesn't start in the 19th century, where it spends most of its time, but rather it begins at the beginning of the 21st century, bringing up a series of attacks that by most commentators and analysts have been linked as part of the global war on terror. These attacks are the 2014 public school attack in Peshawar, which leaves over 130 children murdered, the kidnapping of the Chibok girls in Nigeria, and the Garissa University attack in Kenya of that same year that leaves 147 students dead. In all three of these instances, as I said, the rubric through which they're generally understood is this idea of the global war on terror as an advent of a political Islamist insurgency that the West is trying to fight on a global scale. And yet what the book argues is actually these have deep-seated roots, because when you look at these places, they all lie on the periphery of the modern global system. They all lie on the frontiers of the modern state system, which were constructed as frontiers by the imperial and colonial systems of the late 19th century. It seems that there's an increasing recognition, not only amongst analysts, that these are quote unquote problematic places, but also of governments more recently, with the United States government in 2018 passing something called the Global Fragility Act. And the Global Fragility Act essentially acknowledges that there are these problematic places along the periphery, places that I write about, like the Afghan-Pakistan frontier, the Kenya-Somali frontier, northern Nigeria, where state abilities and competencies are limited, and which are a danger to the standing of the international system. And so the Global Fragility Act actually today requires the American executive to come up with strategies about how to, in combination, try to affect positive change with the resources of the US government in these places. So I think one of the implications of this work in terms of policy is to draw our attention that these are not new or aberrational instabilities that are happening in these places, but actually deep-seated and systemic. I think that kind of outlines the work in its totality. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions and to the discussion.
Okay, so I'd like to begin by telling Ben how thought-provoking and generative I found your book. And I want to particularly highlight the smart way you combine the focus on a particular legal tool and a few key individuals to draw this global map of the concept of frontier governmentality. The book is great to read, and it's also great to use for teaching. And you make it all sound deceptively simple, I think, even in your presentation, but it takes an enormous amount of thinking, I think, and imaginative work, in addition to research, to accomplish this and make it accessible. So that's great. So I'll begin with this sort of question that comes to mind when one first takes this book. And so you begin with Afghanistan, which is a place that has been systematically characterized in the media and as well as policymakers as a place of exception, as ungovernable. And you may take that characterization and turn it on its head, in fact, and say that Afghanistan is not exceptional, and it's neither is its so-called ungovernable, the inability to govern it effectively. It's an inherent way that empires and post-colonial states rule over groups or regions, in regions that they think are ungovernable. So could you speak a little bit for our benefit about how you made this jump? I mean, the process of making this jump and taking it on as an opportunity to really write a global history.
Well, thanks, Dina. That's a great question, and it gives me an opportunity to perhaps delve a little bit deeper into the details because I think they're illustrative. So if I could back up and start actually with the genesis of the work. As I said, my own specialty looking at Afghanistan, there are a set of what are known today as the FATA, the federally administered tribal agencies. There's 7 of them that are along the Pakistan side of the Pakistan and Afghanistan border. These were originally set up in the late 19th century by the British, with the first one being the Khyber Agency in 1878. And I remember when I first encountered these, thinking, wait a minute, for as odd as these spaces are, these spaces feel and sound extraordinarily familiar. And of course, the comparison that immediately popped to mind was, this sounds like a Native American reservation. And that is in effect what the tribal agencies along the Afghan frontier, the native reserves I talk about in Southern Africa and indeed in East Africa, that's in effect what they are. These are all the same sort of administrative spaces. When you talk about the state of exception, of course, then the idea comes that, like the camp, these reservations are, according to Agamben, states of exception, which I think anybody looking at these spaces, that automatically comes to mind, and you start to look at. And I almost immediately rejected that as an intellectual position, because I thought, wait a minute, for being exceptional, there are a lot of these places, right? So in the United States, for example, today there are about 330 Native American Indian reservations. Along the Afghan-Pakistan frontier, there's still the FATA today, the administered tribal agencies, even though they have been supposedly undone by a constitutional amendment. And we see similar reserves and reservations globally around the world. So are we talking about global spaces of exception, which seems unsatisfactory to my mind, to think, well, here's the norm, but there's a lot of places that sit outside of that norm. Maybe then the problem isn't thinking about these spaces as aberrational, but rather that these spaces are actually a part of the norm, and that the norm is not about the universal rule of law or a universal system of politics, but it is about an intentionally fragmented political topography, where the space of exception is not this exception, but itself is the norm. And definitely speaking to historians of South Asia, and I think historians of any imperial undertaking, this sounds extraordinarily familiar. The British, the French, and the Dutch, and everybody rules their colonial empires through difference, through a recognition of communities that are governed by their own individual legal codes, criminal codes, et cetera, et cetera. And that this is just yet one more manifestation of that. And so actually part of the broader argument I want to make in the book is that instead of being these peripheral and exceptional spaces, these are actually central to the design of the international system. An international system that, though our political theorists like to think in terms of a unitary sovereignty, historically and experientially has never been that. And rather than being an exception, the front areas governed by the Frontier Crimes Regulation, the areas under subject to these kind of agency or reservations really are the norm of rule. And that if anything's exceptional, it's the idea of some sort of universal rule of law that has somehow come to dominate our understandings of politics in the early 21st century.
Okay, so there's a lot I can pick up here, but in the interest of time and leaving time for people to ask you questions, I'm going to move to another question that I had in mind, and I actually gave you warning about it because you know, I read your book and then and have been talking to you about it for some time. And then I recently read the book by Mahmoud Mamdani, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, which also came out in 2020, and it's quite a coincidence. And so I was struck when reading his book and your book, again for this discussion, is the sort of similarities of logic that drive both books. Both books are written to try to find answers to question of extreme violence in post-colonial states. And this is how you start your book, as you indicated, these moments of extreme violence. And both of you travel widely to make their point. And in the case of Mamdani, again, he begins with the United States and moves, interestingly, into Germany, South Africa, Sudan, and Israel, Palestine. And both books find in colonial imperial rule the seeds of this violence, although he locates the rule at the formation of modern European nation states and their colonization of the New World in the 16th century. So the time difference is different. So I wonder if I mean, I know you haven't had a chance maybe to look at all his book, but based on your reading of his introduction, whether you see points of convergence and difference, because the book has been widely read and discussed. And it would be interesting to juxtapose both books. So could you speak to that for a little while?
Well, first of all, I thank you, Dina, for bringing Mamdani's book to my attention. And then I'd also, secondly, then actually highly recommend Mamdani's book to the audience as well, because it is a provocative and interesting case study. Before I actually respond about Mamdani's book, there's a point I'd like to pick up that you made in your question, which is the issue of extreme violence. And I'd slightly change the wording of that to spectacular violence, because, and this actually goes to one of the differences I have with Mamdani. My epilogue to the book basically says, when you look at the history of frontiers and frontier governmentality, what you're looking at is a history of violence. And it's a history not only of actual and epistemic violence, but it's a history of pedestrian everyday violence, and then spectacular violence like the incidents that I talked about. And so, you know, I think that both Mamdani and I share a recognition that the colonial undertaking and the imperial undertaking and its afterlife in the post-colonial period is one that is fundamentally grounded in violence. And that, you know, that's a point that we really need to acknowledge with some seriousness and think through the implications of that. In terms of Mamdani's work specifically, there is a lot I agree with and a lot I find really attractive to it. Unfortunately, I'm not as, I'm a little bit more pessimistic than he is because he actually holds up South Africa in his book as a way to escape the post-colonial moment. But I think one of the things he really draws to is the obvious fact that we talk about it as the post-colonial moment, the postmodern moment, that we don't actually deal with the fact that we are still in the grips of these systems of power and exploitation. We think, you know, decolonization happened and then we move into the post-colonial, when in fact these states, and you know, Mamdani in his own work earlier than that really emphasizes that these post-colonial states are in many ways just colonial states by another name. The other point that I would make where I don't want to say disagree with, but move away from Mamdani, and I was surprised for the lack of discussion in that, is that really at the core of my argument is also an argument about political economy. That this system of frontier governmentality that I theorize and then trace historically happens in a certain point in time. And that certain point in time is conditioned by the expansion and entrenchment of a global capitalist system in the late 19th century, which is really foundational not only to the colonial enterprise, but the construction of the modern state system that we inhabit today. And I was surprised in Mamdani's work not to encounter, in what I've read so far, that kind of explicit discussion of the expansion of global capitalism and political economy. So that's one of the differences, key differences I would really articulate.
Okay, so this is my last question has to do with the Middle East, since this is a Middle East forum, I find it fascinating the way you trace this intellectual trajectory of the frontier crimes regulation and its application to Iraq and Palestine and Jordan. So I can speak with some authority on Iraq. What I find where the a version of the frontier crimes regulation was imposed by the British in the Middle East. It's the earliest actually imposition of that in the Middle East when as soon as they went into Basra, and remained on the books until the 1958 revolution, and aspects of it, I would say practices, if not the legal form itself, have been resurrected under Saddam Hussein, and of course by the Americans as a way to fight insurgency, and so as a counterinsurgency measure. But what I find interesting in the Iraqi case, for example, as opposed to what you've talked about in the Afghan case, is that the tribes actually become constitutive of the nation state that is set up. It's a nation tribe marriage, one that Mamdani talks about a little bit for Africa, but we see very clearly in Jordan. And so how do you sort of marry this sort of empowerment of the tribal forms of rule and in their creation and close connection to forms of nation creation?
So let's give credit where credit is due, and that's to you, Dina, in the sense of, I'm sure you recall when we were sitting in your office one day and I was telling you about my work, and you said, Ben, this sounds exactly like what they were doing in Iraq. And so we started kind of, kicking the proverbial can around, and very quickly realized, well, it sounds exactly like what they were doing in Iraq, because it is exactly what they were doing in Iraq. So if I can just briefly trace out the history and then the difference for the post-colonial moment. As you rightly say, the frontier crimes regulation is first passed in British India in 1872. It's repassed in 1887, and then the final form, which is still in effect today in Pakistan, is passed in 1901, as opposed to the Iraqi regulation, which is finished formally in 1958. Now, what's the chain of transmission, as it were? Well, of course, the Mesopotamian theater becomes the theater for the Indian Expeditionary Force during the First World War. And behind the military comes the civil administration. And the head of the revenue department of the Indian Expeditionary Force D, who arrives in November 1914 to Basra Vilayat, is this man named Henry Dobbs. Now, Henry Dobbs had been a frontier revenue official in Baluchistan, and there he had been charged with the application of the frontier crimes regulation to this space. So Dobbs, if you want to be simplistic yet substantively correct about it, arrives in Basra in 1914 and looks out over the marshlands and thinks, I've seen this before. It's marshes instead of mountains, but there are all these kind of tribal people that really are uncivilized and unready for regular administration. So we should rule them by their own customs and traditions. We, of course, being the ones that get to say exactly what those are. So in 1916, he authors the Tribal Civil and Criminal Disputes Regulation, which is then repassed or repromulgated, as it were, in 1918 and taken into the law of mandatory Iraq and remains until the Ba'athist coup in 1958. And what this essentially does is it essentially treats the inhabitants of the Basra Vilayat in the marshlands as kind of under a reservation system where they're to be judged by their own customs and traditions and traditional systems of adjudication. What's then really interesting is, again, the train of transmission and how this gets passed, because in 1923, and here I'm tipping my hat to Alana, it goes from Iraq and begins to manifest itself in mandatory Palestine when H.R. Samuel writes for permission to pass what becomes known as the collective punishments ordinance by citing the Iraq tribal civil and criminal dispute regulation, and says, hey, look, they're doing this in Iraq amongst the marsh dwellers of Basra. I think we should do this amongst the Bedouins of the Negev. And that's eventually passed and integrated into mandatory law in Palestine. And then actually it's kind of continued post-1948 by the Israeli military. Now, the law doesn't become formally replicated in Transjordan, but Glub Pasha, who also cuts much of his teeth in Iraq, actually sees this and in substance replicates the system or core elements of that system in Transjordan by the 1920s. So there's this really interesting chain of transmission and how it works. But then your question is, well, wait a minute, in Iraq particularly, we see a different trajectory where the tribe and state and tribe and nation become mutually constitutive, but that doesn't appear to happen along the Afghan frontier. And why is that? Well, first of all, I'd say, mandatory Iraq, when it becomes national Iraq, as it were, is a different space than Pakistan, right? Because Pakistan is dominated politically by largely an incoming migrant class in the form of the Muhajirs, who by and large then exclude the indigenous population and actually not only retain the law in substance, the frontier crimes regulation, but actually expand it so that the federally administered tribal agencies are augmented with what become the provincially administered tribal agencies during the 1970s. So the governing elite of the post-colonial state of Pakistan don't seek to actually establish state power in an alliance with the tribal elements of the state, but rather really seek to continue the containment of those elements. The better comparison would be directly between Iraq and Afghanistan itself, but Afghanistan doesn't employ this frontier crimes regulation because it's under a different kind of administrative rubric, as it were.
I think I've done my questions. I can pick up a lot later on, but I'm happy to turn it over to the audience. Skip.
Good, thank you, Dina. And I will look back to you if you have something. There was a question that was posed by a friend of mine yesterday, anticipating the program today, and an alum from GW. You really touched on this, but his point was, okay, all these things that happened so long ago, are they still having an impact today? You've sort of talked about it, but could you kind of elaborate just specifically on that point? What's its manifestations today for us?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and this, of course, is of relevance to policymakers. Well, whether we like it or not, we inhabit a system and a world that was by and large, the skeleton of which was constructed in the late 19th century. And we remain beholden to that system. It's a system in terms of politics, of an international interstate system that becomes fully manifest in the post-Second World War moment, but it becomes a system as well that in terms of political economy is about the expansion and entrenchment of global capitalism, which really gets going in the late 19th century. And those systems remain in place. So it's unsurprising with that fact that those systems remain in place, that these areas remain problematic. When I lecture at FSI about Afghanistan, I always try and remind the outgoing diplomats there that if you look at what you think is a long period of time, but historically is actually quite a narrow period of time, which is post-1978, the Saur Revolution, Afghanistan looks like some sort of Hobbesian land of chaos that you'd never want to go to. But if you go back to 1945 or 1944, and you're like, where in the world would I want to be safe and not, in the midst of the world ripping itself apart, Kabul would be an awfully good spot to be, actually. So with that, what relevance does that have to what I'm saying today? In the longue durée, Afghanistan and these lands that are today subject to violence, to peripheralization, to frontier governmentality, was at one point in time actually a center of a regional economic system based in South Asia, which collapsed with the intrusions of British colonialism during the mid-18th century. So too, another place that I look at in the book, for instance, the Somali-Kenyan boundary and up into the Sudan, this too had actually been a place where we have not only political and economic stability, but it's a center to regional patterns of trade and intercourse that again collapses with the advent of British imperialism in the late 19th century. So I think that the short answer, which I don't seem to be very good at giving, is that no, none of these places have recovered. But at the same time, that should not surprise us, because the fundamental systems that render these places peripheries, that subject them to frontier governmentality, remain in place. And that's why, for instance, the enactment of the Global Fragility Act and the recognition of these places as problematic, I don't think is really going to work, because the fundamental issues that condition these places as such are not being addressed.
We have a question from someone participating today, Min Kim. I think you know her. She says, thank you, Ben, for sharing your work on the frontiers. Good to see you today. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether these frontier practices are weapons of weak or fragile states. Put differently, are they tools to substitute the inability to rule directly? Or so do we see these practices as a product of a particular mindset or beliefs of the state leaders who envision and imagine borderlands differently?
So first of all, a shout out to Min, who is a PhD student in American and is doing amazing work in the political science department, addressing many of these similar questions, but on a slightly different frontier, the northeast frontier of British India. So that's actually a plug to read Kim's work, which will be coming out soon and is definitely going to be worth it. Thanks for that great question, Kim, because what it points to is, well, why are these spaces like this? Why are they peripheralized? Why are they subject to frontier governmentality? Is it the states themselves, or is it something about these places and these people? And I think that if we're going to talk about state fragility or weakness, number one, it needs to be acknowledged that it's a relative thing. That especially when we're talking about the 19th century world, we're talking about a world where states are at best peripatetic. Their presence in the lives of their subjects or the people over whom they rule is episodic. They are not constant intrusions into people's lives as are states today. So I think that that's one thing we need to acknowledge. But the other thing I'd say is that all of these spaces are relatively poor. So for instance, in the book, I look at specific places where frontier governmentality is manifest, and it's the Fata, it's the Basra Vilayat, or not all of the Basra Vilayat, but parts of the Basra Vilayat for purposes of the Middle East, the southern Negev that we look at, the border with Transjordan, and then, as I said, the Kenya-Somali frontier. I actually look at some of the reserves in South Africa in the late 19th century. The San Carlos Apache Reservation in Southwest Arizona, which is the second poorest American Indian reservation after Pine Ridge. And then I actually look at the Pampas in Argentina, particular spaces. And one of the striking things that all of these spaces hold in common is their relative poverty. I remember giving a talk about the work at the American Ethnohistory Conference one year, and I put up a picture of Baluchistan, and I put up a picture of the San Carlos Reservation. And I gotta admit, it took me a minute to be able to distinguish the two, because they look exactly the same. These extraordinarily arid, unproductive spaces that then have a semi-nomadic population, which is recalcitrant to rule, as it were, and prone to violently contest that rule. And so in essence, these states, which are not omnipresent, which do have relative power and relative weakness, do a cost-benefit analysis, and that is, well, what if we just put up a fence and say, there be dragons on your side of that fence, keep all your crazy stuff there, and you stay out of our space, and you encapsulate these people, both physically, but also culturally. And time again, that's exactly what happens, is that the cost-benefit analysis is that, regular administration is going to be too expensive and not return the necessary taxes. And so instead, let's encapsulate these people into these systems of frontier governmentality on reserves and reservations. So I'd say it's this combination of, what is the cost benefit of recalcitrant people, poor land, and the fact that these are, for much of their lives, episodic states in their manifestation of power in individuals' lives.
Oh, great. Thanks for that. Ilana Thelman has a question. She says, thanks, Ben. I'm interested in hearing more about the frontier as practice. If part of the goal or reason for frontier governmentality is to manage people without incorporating them, is there a difference when, for comparative example, the US West goes from frontier to the classic way of thinking about it to incorporated space with Indian reservations as a way of dealing with the people? Does this difference make a difference in frontier governmentality terms?
So thank you so much, Ilana, for a great question. And it's really one I could dig into, but in the interest of time, I'll try and be brief. The American example is a great example because it really does go to this issue about frontier's place versus frontier as practice. Because as I talk about in the book, there's the famous Turner article from 1893 where he declares the closure of the American frontier. And he actually backdates it a decade to 1883. But of course, I would argue that actually, no. We still have frontiers in the United States, and the most important ones are these frontiers between the Indian reservations and the non-Indian reservations. Indian territory, Indian country versus non-Indian country, because actually it holds an enormous amount of territory within the United States. What's interesting is then this encapsulation of these people within these spaces and how these administrative systems perpetuate themselves and perpetuate this system of frontier governmentality. Because once these people are encapsulated in a discrete physical space, be it a tribal agency in Afghanistan or be it an American Indian reservation in the United States, the question is, how do we govern and what do we do with these people? The American example brings up an interesting one because whereas, for instance, the British Empire in South Asia and the Middle East don't necessarily have a civilizing mission. I mean, they do to a certain extent, but it's not an assimilative mission. That's very quickly given up. We're not trying to replicate Englishmen in the countryside of Bengal after the 1840s. The United States retains this issue of trying to civilize the barbarians and savages of the reservations. And the key to this project, which actually goes to my point about global capitalism, is in all of these instances, how do you civilize people? It's by making them property owners. So for instance, in the American case with the indigenous peoples of the United States, how do you make Indians civil? Well, you give them land that they are individual owners of in the form of the Dawes Act of 1887, which Theodore Roosevelt then talks about. The great crusher of Indian culture is that we will make these people, home-owning settlers, and that is what's going to accomplish their integration into the American body politic. So too on the northwest frontier of Afghanistan, whereas in all of these instances, colonial and national administrators like to characterize this as a kind of culturally conditioned response to the problem of these people along the frontier. It's always about property. So the Frontier Crimes Regulation has its origins in the Hazara Settlement Report of 1870. And its origins are actually the British go up to the space of the FATA, or the tribal agencies, tries to figure out lines of property ownership. Why? So they can tax them, is utterly confused, and then says, well, actually, why don't we just govern these people collectively by their own culture? So there is very much an attempt to transform these people through property ownership. What becomes interesting is moving to today. Of course, American Indians are made citizens through the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Interestingly, the inhabitants of the FATA are not given Pakistani citizenship until 2001. And the largest movement of civil disobedience going on in Pakistan today, which the army is very violently suppressing, is called the Pashtun Tahafuz movement, wherein the inhabitants of the FATA are actually protesting their treatment and not calling for remedy by treat us differently, treat us special according to our own customs and traditions, but by making claims on the Pakistani state as Pakistani citizens and saying, hey, we want to be part of that citizenship order and you're denying us that routine. So it's a really interesting dynamic going on there.
Very interesting. Another question from our audience today. Whoops, I lost it. Just one second.
I see it. From Valerie, the one about British Indian.
Yeah, many in British India were classic scholars. Did they draw on Roman experiences, Rome's many frontiers, and their work in Afghanistan?
Yes. So this is fantastic. In brief, I know I keep saying that, but so the most important person to define Afghanistan for the modern world is actually the first British plenipotentiary who goes to the court of the Kingdom of Kabul in 1808, 1809, a man named Mount Stuart Elphinstone. And he writes the most important book ever written about Afghanistan, called An Account of the Kingdom of Kabul, which is published in 1815. Famously, Louis Dupree, who was an American anthropologist who worked in Afghanistan for 50 years, when he wrote his book, Afghanistan, published by Princeton University Press in 1980, in the acknowledgments, he says, everything we know about Afghanistan is a mere footnote to the work of Elphinstone. Now, what's really interesting about Elphinstone is when Elphinstone goes to the court of the Kingdom of Kabul, which funnily enough was in Peshawar, which is in modern day Pakistan, in that winter of 1808, 1809, he's got a couple of books with him, right? He's classically learned, as you rightly point out. He went to the University of Edinburgh. I have his, his student records that indicate he sat in classes with David Hume as well as Adam Smith. He's influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment. And he's also a polyglot. He speaks Persian, he reads Greek, he reads Latin, right? All these things. As he's going up to the frontier, one of the key texts that he has is Tacitus's Germania. And he's got it in Latin. Tacitus's Germania, Tacitus, of course, was the Roman historian who writes around 70 in the Common Era. And his work, Germania, is all about how the Roman Empire dealt with the Germanic tribes along the frontier, which would be modern day Croatia. So in going up to the frontier, he's got a model of thinking how these people have been governed elsewhere. And indeed, you know, what the British are doing along the frontier with Afghanistan, or as it's replicated around the world, I sometimes get this question, well, is it that new? And in a way, it's not. Like the Mughals had done similar stuff, the Sikhs had done similar stuff, the Ottomans do similar stuff in their realms. What is fundamentally different is to go back to my last answer, and that is the issue of global capitalism. Because these are also being driven by forces of capitalist production and relations that are fundamentally new and different to the 19th century, and is actually why I call it frontier governmentality, in kind of a nod to Foucault rather than frontier governance. Because in his lectures to the Collège de France in 1978, I think it is, Foucault posits the idea of the political economy emerging as a space where the state can regulate the lives of its subjects through the course of the 19th century. And of course, amongst the best work kind of articulating that, that I'm sure you are all familiar with, is Timothy Mitchell's book. Oh my gosh, now I'm just looking like an idiot because I'm looking at the book, Rule of Experts.
We're really getting close to running out of time, Ben, thank you. But I did have one question. You mentioned this Global Fragility Act, which I have to confess I never heard of before, which might tell you something about how it's impact. But my point being, understanding all that you have said about these frontier whatever, and how to understand the violence, whatever, how in the world is a Global Fragility Act going to be meaningful and having an impact on how we deal with these things?
It won't. This is just spectacle. I mean, this is political spectacle. Let me flip it from the outside to the inside. And this is an anecdote I finished with. So the San Carlos Reservation, the Apache Reservation that I talk about, the second poorest in the United States after Pine Ridge. There's a really interesting thing going on today with the San Carlos Reservation. The San Carlos Reservation has its main body of the reservation, and I should say this, that the San Carlos Reservation in origin is an executive reservation. So it's constructed post-1872, when Congress basically said, we're done signing treaties with Native Americans. That means it's promulgated by the president. And as such, it can be clipped by the president. The San Carlos Reservation has it's a separate part that is not physically contiguous to the reservation, that actually sits in the Tonto National Forest, and it's called Oak Flats. In 1955, this was given through congressional act to the reservation in recognition of the religious significance of Oak Flats to the San Carlos Apache. So 1955, great. And then we have the Indian New Deal, et cetera, fine. Fast forward to today and bring in Rio Tinto. Because on one corner of the San Carlos Reservation is what was formerly the largest copper mine in the Western Hemisphere, and that's the Morenci mine that was operated by Phelps Dodge until they went belly up in 1984, and is now a different conglomerate. Rio Tinto, of course, is sniffing around with the idea, well, if there's a lot of copper there, then there's probably other copper strikes around. Rio Tinto, as an international conglomerate in early 2010s, discovered the largest unexploited reserve of copper in the world under Oak Flats in like 2012 is when they discovered this. So of course, their first act is to go to the San Carlos Apache Nation and try and work out a land swap. You know, we'll take 4,000 acres, we'll give you 7 here. And the San Carlos say, no, this is of religious significance. It's not about the amount of territory, it's about its specific value. Right? Well, of course, that's not going to stop Rio Tinto. So who do they go talk to? They go talk to the then senior senator from Arizona, John McCain, who puts the land swap as a rider onto the National Defense Authorization Act of 1914, you know, a much must-pass piece of legislation, and forces it through. So this kind of idea that we're serious in addressing and ameliorating the legacies of violence, or addressing in any meaningful way the legacies of frontier governmentality, I think is shown as false through this example, you know, within the United States itself. That's within our own domestic architecture, to say nothing about, you know, trying to deal with the Afghan frontier, which of course now we're pulling out September 11th, or someplace like the Kenya-Somali frontier, or someplace like the Middle East. So again, that goes actually back to Dina's original question, where do I diverge from Mamdani? Well, Mamdani is an optimist, and as you can tell, let's just politely say I'm not.
Oh, thank you very much. I wish we had more time. It's been really fascinating. I want to thank Dina for your participation today. Thank you very, very much, Dina, for your observations. But Ben, congratulations on the book, and for such insight, I would say, into state formation, state violence, and the impact of all of that on our world today in the present. So thank you all for joining us. I regret I didn't get to a couple of the questions, but we will copy them from the chat and make them available to Ben in case he would like to respond to them. All right. Thank you all again very much. Wish you a happy good day and a good summer, since this is the last program for the year. Thank you all very, very much, and goodbye.